Knowing who the important stakeholders and challenges in the current situation are, and what impact, outcome and outputs we're aiming at in the future, we can now start planning relevant activities that shall bring about the desired change. But we do not blindly transform our pathway of change into a results matrix. We also have to consider what could possibly go wrong. In Module 2, we learned about the importance of verifying the assumptions underlying the change logic. In this module, we will have a look into the risks associated with a given development intervention. Risk management is a core discipline in project management, and we will be looking into some practical tools for risk management. When assumptions are checked and risks are identified and mitigated, then we can finalize a robust plan in the form of a results framework to summarize the intervention logic, the assumptions and the risks, as well as the indicators and means of verification that will be further developed in Module 4. Having gone through Module 3 on planning for change, you should be able to identify risks and suggest mitigating measures, and establish a results framework that explains how the results are to be achieved, including the causal relationships between inputs, activities, outputs, outcomes, and impact, considering the underlying assumptions and risks identified. Assumptions and risks are two sides of the same coin. Assumptions are statements that we believe to be true, but if these assumptions fail, they will become a risk to our development intervention. Generally, risks are things that can go wrong, external factors that can influence our development intervention negatively. In this submodule, we will give you a brief introduction to how to identify, assess, and manage risks. Risks are inherent in all development work, and therefore risk management is a central discipline in project and program management. We often operate with the following elements of risk management. First, there's risk identification and assessment, with the aim of identifying potential risk and prioritizing them. Secondly, risk preparedness and response. How are we going to respond to the risks if they materialize? We want to identify mitigating measures and develop a risk management plan. In the project implementation phase, you have to monitor your risks closely and also look out for potential new risk. First phase, risk identification and assessment. As with the other RBM tools, it is important to involve the key stakeholders in the risk identification and assessment. The process is not very complicated. You simply bring together the relevant people and brainstorm on things that can go wrong. If the list of potential risks is long, it might prove useful to assess and prioritize the risks. On the next slide, you will see a simple risk assessment matrix that contains two central features. One, the probability of the risk materializing, and two, the importance of the consequences if the risk materializes. Remember, risk identification is a proactive process that you want to do before you're surprised by the risks. Here's an example of a simple risk assessment matrix that has been filled out in relation to the journalist training example we have used previously. Why do we want to prioritize our risks? Well, primarily in order to be able to focus on the most important risks and make sure that they do not jeopardize our interventions. Once risks have been assessed, they can be presented in a diagram like this. But you can also just stick to the matrix. The diagram shows that risks that have a high probability of happening and a serious consequence if they do are the ones we want to focus on first. The next two phases in risk management are risk response and risk management in the implementation phase. When it comes to risk response, there are several ways of handling risks. Sometimes it's possible to identify so-called mitigating measures that will reduce or eliminate the impact of the risks if they materialize. Often we cannot eliminate the risk entirely, so we have to have what we call a plan B if it materializes. If, for instance, you work with a nuclear power plant, you will make sure that the risk of having a serious accident is very, very low. But you will still want to have a plan B if an accident should happen anyway. Another way of handling risk is to try to avoid them by redesigning our intervention. If there is a risk that a certain stakeholder will obstruct the project, we might consider either to make the project more interesting to this stakeholder or involve the stakeholder even more and have them take even more responsibility. Including reserves in budgets and time schedules can also help absorb the negative consequences of some risks, but it will cost you time and money. When it comes to risk management in the implementation phase, the key thing to do is to monitor the risk situation. You want to find out what are the most critical risks right now. Have any new risks emerged, or can we see some risk emerging? And finally, are there any of the previously identified risks that no longer are relevant and can be discarded? Good program managers, they monitor not only activities, time and resources, but also assumptions and risks. Now it's time for an exercise. Use the project or program that you used for the stakeholder analysis, the problem analysis, the theory of change, and the assumptions. Identify the risks associated with a successful implementation of the program. Prioritize the risks using the risk assessment matrix. Suggest mitigating measures to address these risks, either by readjusting the setup of the project or by adding supplementary activities. You can pause the video if you need this slide to stay on the screen. Welcome back from the exercise. Hopefully you can now see the usefulness of risk identification, risk assessment, and risk response. Before we finish this submodule on risk management, we want to draw your attention to 3 key points. First, there is risk involved in all development interventions. So good project and program managers, they identify, they assess, and they respond to foreseen risk before they materialize. Secondly, risks can be related to external factors, to stakeholders, to security issues, to reputation, and to many other things. If you remember to involve the key stakeholders, you will be able to identify more risk than if you did this exercise only by yourself. Thirdly, clever risk management increases the chances of success of your development intervention considerably.